Hi, and welcome to the lecture for Unit 2. I'm going to give you some historical background for the primary text, but basically we are moving from monasticism in the Near East into the religious experimentation found in Western Europe in the High Middle Ages. So really taking a quick jump forward in time and place. So hopefully this gives you enough context to make sense of where we're at. But as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me and let me know. Let's get started. Okay, so as I mentioned, we are jumping forward in time to the High Middle Ages. But before we get there, it's important to have some context about things that are happening in the church leading up to this point. So, as you might recall, or you should recall, in the last unit, we were talking about the early standards of monasticism and how those standards were informed by contemporary anxieties surrounding gender identity. So, we're going to pick up where we left off. The spiritual climate of early monasticism up until the Middle Ages was heavily based on discipline and obedience to the church hierarchy. So, as these positions become more powerful and elaborated upon, you can see how the church hierarchy kind of expands and it grows alongside centralized government in Western Europe. So, as monasticism grew, the monks continued to think of themselves in a militant context. That is, fighting in a spiritual war against evil. But their life actually became far more structured and standardized than what you saw in the readings for Anthony and Mary. For example, the monastic rule of St. Benedict was written about around 516 by Benedict of Nursia, and it gave strict guidelines for how to live in a monastic community. Um, Benedict himself actually preferred to live as a hermit. As you can see in the image here, he is sitting in his little cave, very much secluded from the world, like St. Anthony or Mary. But eventually, he was such a popular guy that he was in demand by other religious communities. And they begged and they pleaded, and he finally conceded to form a community at Monte Cassino, which is on top of a mountain outside of Rome. And he agreed to this because he felt that God was calling him to help others live a more perfect life. And so you can see these images here in the slide. They come from a 14th century manuscript, and they actually highlight his progression from a life of solitude in the cave into his life of communal living in the monastery. And you'll note that he had to fight demons in both contexts. So Benedict essentially recognized that men living together needed to have structure, basically, to maintain stability and to maintain their mission of praising God without distractions or conflicts of interest. So it's not enough to simply live outside of the community together. It's not enough to simply want to be pure together. You actually need guidelines in place to ensure that you're reaching that goal every day. Otherwise, sin could easily creep into the community and it would pollute the entire establishment, right? So it becomes really important for monks to stay vigilant and to make proper use of their time, particularly to maintain this fight against temptation. So monastic rules like Benedict's established everything from when to eat, when to work, when to pray, and when to sleep. The abbot, or the leader of the monastic community, in a female context, they're called an abbess. So the abbot was supposed to enforce the rule and then discipline the other monks like a stern father, which made humility and obedience the defining virtues of monastic life. Their masculinity in this sense was tied to their ability to endure hardships, and their sexual prowess was substituted for the procreation of converting others. So they're still thinking about themselves in this patriarchal context, right? But they're actually doing something very different from what everyday men in society are doing. So they have to kind of think about themselves and their performance of masculinity along the same terms. By submitting to the authority of the abbot, the monk was actually submitting to the authority of God and preparing to serve obediently in the kingdom of heaven. So you can see again, there's this real comparison between what men are doing in secular society and their civic duties and what monks are doing in the monastery and their spiritual duties. In both contexts, it's very important to recognize your place in the hierarchy. These ideas can be seen in devotional art from the early medieval period, which typically represented Jesus like an emperor of the world, seated triumphantly on a throne rather than crucified and emaciated on the cross. So ideologically, you can see how Christ seated on a throne is a much different message, a message of power, right? Authority, a message that invokes the feeling of submission in the viewer, in contrast to looking at Christ on the cross, in which case you might feel sorrow, you might relate to Christ on a more one-to-one level. So there's still kind of a divide happening in terms of people's relationship with the divine and God. God as a man. Other monastic groups were established, obviously, besides Benedict's, but ultimately, all of these monastic groups that are coming out of the medieval period, they look to Benedict's rule as a blueprint for how to do it right. So Benedict's model of monasticism was very, very influential throughout the entire medieval period in shaping how the standards of spiritual perfection would be practiced. So you will be reading a text written by Peter Damian from the 11th century that idealizes monks as knights of God. And so keep this context in mind when you're looking at how he's representing his masculinity and how it intersects with his religious devotion. His perspective highlights how the monastic ideal of masculinity, again, was not unlike the everyday layman's ideal of masculinity, in the sense that both were centered around their contributions to society. Basically, monks like Peter believed that their spiritual fight against sin was the equivalent of the military defense of the city. So they're contributing to the welfare of their community on a regular basis in the same way that everyday secular men would be. This brings us to one final point of important context. Initially, only monks took vows of chastity. So thinking about Anthony and how he's fighting temptation, even Mary, how she's fighting temptation. But in particular, monks were the ones who really focused their lives around overcoming their sexuality. And the clergy actually continued to maintain social bonds and family units, including wives, actually, up until the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century. So basically, priests, unlike monks, were able to maintain more traditional avenues of proving their masculinity. They could actually fight in wars. They could literally father children. And so we will get more into the context of the reforms next week. But for now, you really need to know that Pope Gregory VIII established the new guidelines for the clergy in the 11th century to make the clergy seem more credible to the laity, to sort of hold them up, right, as a comparable ideal to the monks, who were increasingly seen as the real spiritual authorities because of their performances of spiritual perfection. So essentially, unlike monks, the clergy were seen as accumulating social status, as building up wealth for their families, and in the minds of the laity, this was a major distraction from what their primary concern would be, which is taking care of their community and bringing the community to salvation. So these reforms issued by Gregory mark a turning point in the history of the church, because unlike previous popes, Gregory actually had the authority to enforce these new standards. And he actually used bishops like Peter Damian, who would preach and write letters and encourage other priests and bishops to embrace this new clerical ideal. So here we are in the 11th century, and the church is now a really centralized institution with a very centralized hierarchy, and the Pope can enforce his ideas in a more concrete way. So you will see in the reading how Peter stresses that real men just aren't dominated by their physical desires, and they must constantly fight off sexual temptation to maintain their connection to God. And these physical demands of asceticism, of the self-renunciation, and of the life of the clergy were promoted as parallel to the physical labor demanded by a layman, thereby giving priests and monks the ability to maintain their sense of masculinity, even though those traditional avenues of marriage and fighting in wars were suddenly taken away. So, historians have argued that the enforcement of celibacy in the 11th century actually just destabilized the paradigm of masculine identity in the church, and it led to new spiritual ideals for men who were looking for different ways of validating their masculinity. Okay, so that brings us into the High Middle Ages. Following these new attitudes surrounding masculinity and the new standards for the clergy, by the 12th century, the popular devotion of monks was becoming more and more gender fluid. Such men began to look inward to find God, frequently meditating on Christ's love for humankind and really striving to love others in the same universalizing way. So historians have called this moment the discovery of the self, in that medieval men and women became interested in the inner landscapes and the core of human nature, and just generally more self-conscious and introspective. This is also the moment when you start to see more emphasis put on confession and the importance of confessing one's sins and taking stock of one's kind of daily actions and how those actions relate to this bigger pattern of their life. So such people began to question the root of their desires and to experiment with new ways of relating to God on an individual level. And when I say an individual level, this is a sharp contrast to the hierarchy that we've been thinking of so far. Just the same way that Mary and Anthony fled into the desert and wanted to connect with God on a one-to-one. As society becomes more centered around Christianity, that became increasingly important for people, because otherwise their experiences in the church are heavily mediated through the clergy. So the saints in the previous unit, you saw overcoming physical temptations, overcoming battles against lust, and they were ultimately secluding themselves to try to take these steps towards spiritual perfection. But in contrast, in the 12th century, holy men and women actually focused on overcoming their internal conflicts in private by cultivating their love for God in a variety of ways. So the main kind of shift here is that we don't actually have to flee into the wilderness to be with God. We should be able to be with God wherever we're at. Everything in the world should be a sign that reminds us of our love for God and the corresponding love that we feel for God and all of God's creation. So in other words, desire itself, by the time we're in the 12th century, desire itself is not the problem. The self did not need to be denied entirely. Instead, the self needed to be trained to love things in the proper way. So one should learn how to redirect all of their desires toward God. So there's still an embrace of asceticism, but the end goal is just slightly different, right? It's not just about self-renunciation and overcoming the confines of our body. And in fact, the body is something that could be a tool to bring one closer to God. It follows that theologians began to assert that one's total love of God was the ultimate proof of their spiritual perfection, not just their ability to endure hardships. Chastity, therefore, remained important, but only as far as it indicated that one had actually committed themselves to God. It wasn't as much this emphasis on like self-denial at this point. It was still important, though, to recognize the authority of the abbot, the authority of the clergy, and the general hierarchy of the church. However, these relationships between religious men were presented now in more nurturing and maternal terms. And on an individual level, holy men began to define their union with God by drawing on familiar tropes of courtly love. So you can imagine, if God is all-encompassing love, that sort of connection, that emphasis on emotion makes God likened to a woman. And it also makes men be able to liken themselves to a bride. So you will look at texts from the 12th and 13th centuries that highlight these new trends in Christian devotion. First, you're going to read the writings of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, a French abbot of the Cistercian order. Like the Benedictine order, the Cistercians lived a life of work, prayer, and self-denial. However, their rule framed the abbot as a nurturing mother rather than as a stern father. Bernard's texts illustrate the creative ways in which monks began to think of Jesus as a mother and bride. Bernard uses the biblical imagery of Song of Songs to imagine himself as the loving bride of Christ. And you will notice that his imagery subverts gender expectations and borders on the homoerotic at times. But at the same time, it's important to remember that Bernard and all of these other figures are really experimenting with different ways of imagining their intimate bond to Jesus and to God, broadly speaking. So, for example, you can see this illustration here of Bernard's vision of receiving the breast milk directly from the Virgin Mary, which allowed him, in theory, right, to receive the same spiritual nourishment as the Christ child and to spiritually join into the Holy Family. So you can see already how that's a very intimate bond, right? The bond of a mother and a child. And so Bernard plays on that to describe his relationship with God, but he also leans into, as I mentioned, the more erotic language of bridal love. This is just to say that the eroticism in the text is just one of many expressions of his love for God. Similarly, you will read about St. Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order, which is not technically a monastic order, but we don't actually need to worry about that too much right now. We'll think about this more later in the next unit. But basically, you will be given scenes from his Vita or from his hagiography that highlight how Francis idealized himself as a woman to represent his bond and prophetic authority. But he also seems to feel anxiety about the presence of real life women in his everyday life. And you can think about kind of all of the tensions surrounding the role of women in the church, and particularly the idea of women as sexual temptresses that's creating such a big divide between the clergy and women in terms of how they claim authority. You will get more historical context on these figures, obviously, in the secondary readings. But for now, I want you to focus on the way these men are describing their relationships with God, they're describing their relationships with a spiritual family, and how they're associating themselves with femininity, broadly speaking. So think about the ways that gender is informing their claims to spiritual perfection, and also how these claims and these new configurations of their relationship with God actually allow them to claim more of an intimate prophetic union than they otherwise could have. So they're really trying to distinguish themselves and verify, to validate to themselves, but also to their audience, that they are truly all-encompassing God's love within themselves. So keep that in mind, and I hope the readings go well. Before I let you go, I really want to give you a little bit of evidence for how these kind of ideological shifts and gender fluidity are happening in devotional art as well. So, as I mentioned, medieval people began to view Jesus in feminine terms because of the devotional emphasis on his maternal love. Basically, the idea of the crucifixion, Jesus sacrifices himself and embraces pain on behalf of his spiritual children. And this is not unlike the love, the unconditional love that a mother would feel for her child. So they're really kind of elaborating on this association. Although this manuscript that you can see here is from the 16th century, it highlights how men like Bernard and Francis began to imagine Jesus as a mother. So as I mentioned, art of Jesus evolves over time. Devotional art evolves over time, and there's not one fixed version of Christ. However, prior to the 12th century, we know for sure in art history that the wound of Christ, the wound that a soldier creates in the side of Christ while he's hanging on the cross, is generally depicted on the lower abdomen. And again, that makes good sense, and because that's how it's described in the biblical story of the crucifixion, is that he's punctured on his side. However, one very important shift that we see happening in iconography of Jesus after the 12th century is that this wound begins to take on feminine qualities. And as you can see in the image, it actually moves up. Jesus, you can see, is gesturing toward the wound, which appears on his right breast. The wound is dripping blood, and he appears to be looking down at it with a deep sadness, which would provoke a similar sense of longing in the audience. So the gesture is very reminiscent of a nursing mother, and the placement of the wound under his breast actually is likening his blood to the nourishing milk of a mother. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I would be happy to talk about that more in office hours. But for now, I'm going to give you a few more examples. So you will notice that this is a 12th century representation of Christ's wound, and perhaps this is obvious to you, but maybe not. The wound vaguely resembles a woman's vulva, which highlights the way Christ's suffering became associated with motherhood. And so again, symbolically, I think you can see how these things are sort of naturally coming together. Just like a woman goes through childbirth and is willing to die for her children, she embraces suffering in order to bring new life. Likewise, Christ on the cross was suffering and was trying to bring about the salvation of all of humankind. So it's the same type of self-renunciation, and that framework basically allows people to start thinking of Jesus, as I said, in more feminine terms. So you can see this is a reliquary or a devotional object, which would have been used for private meditation in someone's home. So it would have contained a small piece of bone, probably in the center, from a deceased saint, and a pious man or woman would pray near the reliquary, typically maybe in front of it, and they would use the power of this relic, the power of the remains of the saint, to amplify their prayers. They might also use it to keep their mind focused on Christ's love and suffering on the cross while they're meditating on scripture. So devotional objects like this were really important to this internal, inward introspective shift that we see in the 12th century. This 14th century representation of Christ's wound is more explicitly modeled after a woman's vulva, as you can see. And again, this image really is meant to stress Christ's association with motherhood. So the cross in the background reminds the audience that the wound signifies Christ's ultimate sacrifice for his spiritual children. And it's interesting to note that this book, actually, this breviary, was owned by a laywoman. And perhaps this image actually helped her associate more intimately with the body and suffering of Christ. So for a woman, it's really powerful to be able to relate to God on this level and see yourself in Christ. Particularly since women were not allowed to be in the clergy because of their female embodied differences from men. So by making Christ more feminine, Christ actually becomes more of a model for women. This 15th century representation of Christ emphasizes his sacred heart as well as the wounds from the crucifixion. And you can see that there is a little layman praying at the feet of Christ, and Christ is again gesturing towards the wound on his right breast. So Christ's heart is positioned between him and the man, and the heart itself in this case has been transformed into the wound. Again, that was initially on the lower side. It's been moved up to the breast, and now it's taken out of the body, and you can see the wound is his heart itself. So it appears that the man is praying to the heart as an extension of Christ. And again, you can see how this is really emphasizing Christ's love for humankind and blending together these themes of love and suffering by having all of this blood. So this highlights how men could also associate with the compassionate, loving, and maternal nature of God. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion. I hope this has given you the basic context that you need to understand the readings and these evolving ideals of sanctity, particularly evolving standards of masculinity in the church. The secondary sources will go much more in depth, but you should be able to answer the discussion board questions with this framework in mind. As always, if you have any questions or if you want to talk through your analysis of the readings, if you need more context to grab onto to really understand the significance of these texts, please, please, please reach out to me to schedule a meeting. Until then, happy reading. And don't forget that you should be narrowing down your paper topic this week and meeting with me to get it approved. So I hope to see you all at some point this week. Happy reading.